So, I'm going to be making a video very shortly. I've decided to make a video very shortly about my favourite computer. The computer I most loved for the most time, and I still love today. And I still have today. But I thought to get there, I suppose I ought to go through the other things I've had on the way, all the stuff I had building up to get to that, and then what I've got now and what I do with them now. And that will include a bit of consoles as well as PCs or computers as such. So with me, obviously because of my age and heritage, no, just because of my age, I've managed to sort of go through the transition from computers sort of first coming out for the home right up to today. Really there from the 70s onwards. The first thing we ever got actually wasn't a computer, because computers didn't exist for the home. So the first thing we got as a family, I think my dad must have, I think he won something at the casino once. And it cost a lot of money, but he bought an Atari 2600. Probably a couple of years after it came out. So we're probably looking around about the end of the 70s, 78, 79, something like that, I think. Cartridge-based system. You had to buy, realistically, 3 different controllers. And for each person, that meant you had 6 controllers. 1 joystick, did quite a few games. 1 paddle, and I called it a paddle, it was a dial thing, which was for the tennis games and some of the other up and downy games. And then a different one for the driving games. Now, of course, that was quite expensive, and I remember the cartridges themselves were quite expensive, and we started off with a fair few cartridges. To be perfectly honest, if you've ever played the Atari 2600, if you've never seen it, I'll give you a look. Utterly rubbish, to be fair. Now, at the time, it was sort of like, it was amusing. We was like, oh, great, we had to think the first game we played, and the game we played the most of was a game called Outlaw, which was 2 cowboys, but it only tended to be about 3 colours, and it was very, very blocky. The other one was tennis, which obviously was just Pong. And there's a few other games, Pac-Man, again, 2 or 3 colours and stuff. I think the system had 8 colours in total, but it could only show a handful at a time, so you only ever really saw a very small amount, especially from Atari. Now, things only got better when Activision came along after Atari forgot to copyright the software. So the software for the cartridges, they forgot to copyright it, which allowed other companies to come in and make software. Activision came along and made software. It was cheaper and it was a lot better. So we ended up with games like Pitfall, which actually was really good. And there was another game, like a Defender game as well. I can't remember how long we had it for and what we did with it after we stopped using it. But I remember come the 80s, 1981, we got the ZX81 Sinclair machine, which was a computer. It didn't have a proper keyboard, it had like a flat panel thing. You could buy it as a kit and build it yourself, or you could buy it pre-made. It came with 1K of memory. It had an expansion pack to 16K, which of course we got. So we got a thermal printer for it, of course. I say, of course, it was quite a luxury to have a thermal printer, because you thought, well, this thing's a tool. My parents bought it hoping that we would learn something from it. It's going to be an educational thing to do homework and stuff. But the printer was black and white. It was thermal. It faded quite badly. The machine was black and white. It only had black for the text, white for the background. And you needed a tape player to load software into it. Now, it did come with didn't come with an operating system as such. It came with a very, very, very basic form of basic. You use that to load your software, but you could also write programs with it, and programs with magazines, and you could sit down and magazines would have tens and tens of pages of code to sit and write in to teach you how to write games or software that helps you with writing or whatever. It didn't have to be games, it could be anything, but obviously as kids the only thing you're really interested in is fun. But again, we had that for a few years, and again, technology moved really, really fast in the 80s. So by the time it got to about 83, Sinclair brought out the ZX Spectrum, which was a colour machine. More memory, at 48K of memory. Now, we didn't get one of that. Everyone else I knew had one. Everyone else I knew had like things like the VIC-20 or the Dragon 32. A mate of mine had one. I've actually still got 2 bits of his software up in my loft. But we didn't get any of that. So my dad managed to get hold of a computer from a photography club he was in. They had lots of computers, and he managed to get hold of a BBC Micro Model B. Yeah, it was massive. It had sort of black keys and red keys, and it was colour, but again, it wasn't really a gaming machine like everyone else that I knew had. This machine was bought for us to be able to learn from and to sort of become, or end up being solicitors maybe one day in my life, or a doctor at a later point. It did eventually have some games on it. We did get some software for it. It was a racing game which was really, really good, by a guy called Jeff Crammond. Also a Spitfire flight game. So maybe we'll learn to be pilots through this super duper fantastic computer. We ended up getting a game, one of the biggest games or biggest titles of the 80s was a game called Elite, which was a space trading game. You flew through space, traded between planets, fought, battled, built your ship. It was a very open world-ish, but it was only in black and white, and it was vector graphics. It was just basically line graphics, but it was incredibly addictive, and everybody I knew wanted to play it, and everyone I knew wanted to come out and play it on our machine, because at the time the BBC was the only machine that played it. But of course all my friends and everyone else I said had proper sort of gaming machines as such, games computers. Now the BBC microcomputer was really a school machine. It was an education machine. A machine all the schools had them, although my schools didn't. I didn't have computers when I was at school initially. I was a bit too, well, I don't know, cheap school. So of course it wasn't really the sort of the up and in machine. And Acorn, the company that made it, knew that, and eventually brought out a thing called the Acorn Electron, which was more like the gaming machine that other people wanted. The home machine wasn't like the machine everybody had at school. And of course eventually I don't think it didn't fare as well as the other machines. It didn't really compete with the Spectrum and the Commodore 64. Strange thing is, many years later, and I mean many years later, after all that hype and all those computer things died off, we did end up with an Acorn Electron. Strange thing is, we've got that and a lovely book, and this is how computers were sold to you back then. A book giving you examples of what you should and shouldn't be able to do on it. The book, the computer, nothing else. No power supply, no leads to connect it to anything else like a TV or anything like that. I don't even know where I got it. My dad picked it up at some sort of flea market once, which was a bit of difference with the other computers. I remember with the BBC, we went to buy some bits for it. I think we bought something. I know we bought something to go with the BBC. I can't remember what it was. I think it was some software, maybe a joystick or something for the BBC. We had to buy off this guy in Canterbury, in Surrey. And it was this massive, great big posh house. Enormous, great big posh house. Back off the road, and went up there, and this guy was sort of like some sort of cricket captain of somewhere, and he had this enormous, great big house. And we only wanted to buy a couple of bits that went on the BBC, but that was the only sort of people that owned them at the time. We were definitely not like that at all. At the end of the 80s, you end up getting things like the Sega Master System and the original Nintendo Entertainment System. But up until that point, it was sort of like computer-based things, so the Spectrum was the way to go forward. I eventually bought a Spectrum. I bought a 48K Spectrum Plus with my own money. So when I earned some money, I went to Boots in Canterbury and bought a Spectrum. I loved it. I had lots of games on it. The thing with those, again, it was tape-based, so you played tapes to load your games. And of course, you didn't buy any games. Everybody you knew had games. Somebody you knew had a double tape deck, and you just gave them a blank tape. They gave you a tape full of games. And the thing is, they all took about 10 minutes to load, and sometimes they wouldn't load. You'd have to start again. They had these funny little lines going down the side. Now, I did play that quite a lot, if I remember rightly. I had a little colour TV, for an Amstrad TV that I bought, so I could use it. And I had loads and loads of these games, as I said, from friends and everybody else. One of my favourite games, I had 3 favourite games, I think. I had a game called Gyroscope, which was like a Marble Madness type thing. Another game I really liked was a game called 3D Death Chase. Very, very basic. It was just flying through trees on this basic premise from Star Wars Return of the Jedi. Sort of like the bikes. You're flying through the trees, chasing people and shooting them. But again, remember, this is Spectrum, so it's very, very basic. You've only got 8 colours, and the colour bled everywhere. So you have big blocks and sprites of chunks of colour all over the place. Another game I really liked, and a game I did play an awful lot, was a game called Cyclone. Cyclone was a sort of a helicopter-based 3D game on the Spectrum, which was really interesting, really good. It came out quite late, I think about 87, something like that. It was a very addictive game. You sort of had to go around from island to island, saving people, picking people up, and picking up parcels, missing the cyclone that was coming. So if it's too windy, you couldn't fly, or you'd crash and die. It was brilliant. I loved it. Used to love that. I used to play that for ages and ages and ages. It was sort of like a precursor, I suppose, to eventual things like Desert Strike. The Spectrum, again, things moved fast. At some point, the Spectrum really was out of date. And now, for some strange reason, I got a typewriter And when I got the typewriter, I got the bug for writing. So the next computer I got, I suddenly decided instead, rather than my Spectrum, I bought an Amstrad CPW word processor, dual disc, black and white, although it was sort of a screen with discs built in, so it's an all-in-one unit really. Only had a green screen, so the writing was green on a black background. Very, very businessy. It had its own built-in operating system, its Amstrad operating system, which was lines and things to work. So you had some form of operating system to be able to use it. But it was basically just a word processor. So I could do some names and addresses and stuff like that, add a database. And it came with a printer, a proper dot matrix printer, i.e. a full-size printer. The printer was incredibly noisy. It screamed when you printed. My dad went absolutely mental at night when I was using it. If I was writing something and I wanted to print that off, which you generally did, it screamed away and he was like, what the bloody hell's that noise? It's shouting the old road down. You can hear that in flipping Margate. But it did do a really good job of printing, so I had a lot of use out of it and I learned a lot from it, and that was, I think, the purpose of getting it, was I wanted to learn from it, and I didn't pay much for it. I remember at the time they were supposed to be £400. I worked at a Dixon's over Christmas one year, and they had some downstairs, and they had one of them that didn't work. And I couldn't mark up my mind whether I wanted to buy a computer or not. And I said to the manager, what are you doing with these? And he said, oh, I don't know, I'm going to get rid of them. I said, I'll give you 50 quid for the one that don't work. And he said, yeah, all right. So I took one home, fiddled a tiny little bit, and it worked perfect. Now, you've got to remember also that a lot of these machines, these computers, were all text and DOS based as such. Or DOS based. DOS didn't really exist for home computers as such. Business machines were starting to use DOS then, but these were all text-based, some sort of system, some sort of proprietary system they built themselves. Apple had brought out the Mac in '84, but if you think about things like the Spectrum I think cost me £129. The Amstrad, as I said, would have been £400. The Apple Mac, which was the little boxed Apple Mac, again, only two colour, black and white, it was over, I think, about £4,000, £5,000 in the UK when it first came out. Unbelievably expensive. But by the end of the 80s, it was still, from mid-80s onwards, it was the only computer that had a Windows-based system and a mouse. Now, Windows itself didn't come out until the 90s. I remember Windows, I think early versions of Windows were about 91, 92, something like that. I think 92 it was for the first version of Windows. So the Mac was way ahead of that, but nothing else had it. Eventually, a machine called the Atari ST came along. Now, my mate Anthony had an Atari ST. It was a fantastic machine. I think I still had my word processor at the time. The Atari was a GRU-based machine, so it had a graphic user interface with a mouse, little boxes for screens, icons, that sort of stuff. It was great. That was, I think it was 512 colours. So again, you jumped along from the early 8-bit machines, which were 8 colours, 16 colours and 32 colours, suddenly to a machine that had 512. It was quite a big jump. He had that for a few years, and we used to get software from a guy in Sunderland. It was great, it was fantastic, but I didn't really use it. I didn't have one. I saved up, and eventually I bought my favourite computer of all time, the Commodore Amiga A500, which came from Sunderland. Now, it wasn't made in Sunderland, it was made in China, designed in California by a bunch of hippies, but I bought mine from a guy in Sunderland who sent it through the post. Again, it was quite expensive, it was about 400 quid, but that was a 16-bit machine. It had better graphics than things like the Mega Drive, and it had far, far better stereo sound. It had memory expansion, so you could go up to 1 megabyte, and I got mine with 2 disk drives, because it again used a mouse, which was a GUI system again, icons, windows if you wanted it, a system called Workbench, and this one had 4,096 colours, which at the time was massive because nothing else had that. You went from the Atari 512 colours to this 4,096. Massive difference. All of a sudden, this was the thing to have. It became the entertainment system for Europe. Not just for games, but also for lots of creative software, music writing, design, graphics, that sort of stuff, publishing. You could even do word process on it. I had a few word processors, but it didn't work with my Amstrad printer, so I didn't have any way of printing anything on it, but I could write stuff. I could do things like auto route. There was loads of things you could get that made it quite a useful tool, but also a very, very good gaming machine. Now, initially I had mine set up on a desk that my dad made, actually. It was sort of a wooden and metal desk my dad made. Had it on my old TV. I eventually replaced that with a nice flat screen Sony, 2 disk drives and lots of discs and a handful of joysticks and stuff for it. And I use that a hell of a lot, an awful lot, but I will do a separate video about it another time. The thing is, again, that was up through the 90s, but I'd sort of by then, I'd got to going out, finding the pub, finding nightclubs. And then you sort of got to not using your computer as much, not playing games as much. And then I got a girlfriend, and really playing games wasn't that interesting. We played the games together on the computer. We played a pinball game called Pinball Fantasies, which was brilliant. She loved playing it, I loved playing it. But other than that, it sort of dwindled out and it faded away because I had many other things to do instead. Like everything else, it went up in the loft. And really, I went without for a while. By the time I bought my first Mac, I was with another girlfriend and we was actually living together. And I bought a Mac from a big PC World store in Lakeside, which was absolutely useless. They were terrible, the worst place you could ever buy anything from ever. But again, I bought this massive, great big tower with a monitor and a printer, and that cost me a bloody fortune. I remember right, I think I paid about 1,800 quid or something ridiculous for it. At the time, state of the art. It had a CD drive, which the other things I had hadn't had a CD drive. And it had a proper printer and so on. I hadn't gone down the games route with a computer because I wanted to be sort of sensible. I wanted to do stuff on it. I wanted to do photography. I had software like Photoshop, Publisher, Illustrator, those sorts of programs that you could use to do stuff that was sort of productive. And I also had downstairs the PlayStation, because the PlayStation had suddenly come along a couple of years beforehand. I bought the PlayStation, the PS1, which was a 32-bit system. Again, I don't think it had any more colours than the Amiga, but the graphics were better. It handled 3D graphics better. Nothing else really, it was just a better system, smaller. With the PlayStation, you had just a controller to control it. You didn't have to have any keyboards or stuff like that. You didn't need to plug other disk drives into it. You just put a disc in the top. It was very, very simple, sat under the telly, had loads of games. That Mac sat in a spare room on a desk that I'm still using today, so I've still got the same desk now that I had that Mac sitting on. The PS1 sat downstairs under the telly. That's here on top of my desk, on top of the Xbox One, the Xbox 360, and sitting on top of the PS1 is the Switch. By the time I got another computer, which was the G4 Mac, which was sort of a blue, well, it wasn't, it was a graphite Mac, very expensive, again, 1,500 quid, something like that, without a monitor. That was just for the unit. That was much more powerful. They said in their adverts, the first supercomputer. Again, I wasn't using it for gaming, so all my mates had gaming PCs, and they were like, oh, well, we won't want a Mac because we want to play games. Well, I thought, fair enough. But I don't play games, so that's not what I want to do with it. I've got a console for that. By which time, I had this Sega Dreamcast. So the Dreamcast downstairs, Mac upstairs. Dreamcast is still in the loft. The Mac still in the loft, funnily enough. And that's sort of the progression. I then carried on with Macs, buying Macs, doing stuff, photos and stuff. And games-wise, I only played on consoles. So I ended up with the first ever Xbox. I had a GameCube, Wii, Nintendo Wii. I had the Xbox 360, the Switch, and now the Xbox One. And I've also had handheld games like the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Color, and now the Nintendo DS. So there's all sorts of things that I've had for doing the games on, and computers have ended up being serious for doing music, photos, video editing and all that sort of stuff, sort of played away from doing gaming on them. Which is in a way why I miss the Amiga. The Amiga sort of, I did everything on the Amiga. But as I said, I will get into that in another video, and it will be another sort of techie type video.